What remains? Hypnosis? There is no hypnosis on earth that can toss a man 1,000 kilometres away. Or is he only imagining himself in Yalta? Perhaps he is, but then, is Yalta's criminal investigator imagining it as well? No, forgive me, but such things do not happen. And yet, aren't the telegrams coming from there? The financial director's face was literally frightening. Meanwhile, the doorknob outside was being twisted and jerked to the messenger girl's frantic screaming. "No way! I'm not letting you in! Cut my throat! I still won't! Urgent meeting!" Rimsky composed himself as well as he could, picked up the receiver and said, "Super urgent connection to Yalta, please." "Smart," Varyonika exclaimed in his head. But the connection to Yalta did not come. Rimsky hung up and said, "Line is down. Rotten luck." Evidently the broken line had especially upset him and driven him further into thought. Pondering a while, he picked up the receiver with one hand and began writing down all that he said with the other. "Take a superspeed wire. Variety, yes. Yalta. Criminal investigator, yes. Today, around 11:30, Likodiev spoke me telephone Moscow. Stop. After this, did not come to work. Cannot be located by phone. Stop. Confirming handwriting. Stop. Taking observation measures, specified artist. Stop. Financial director, Rimsky." Very smart, Varyonika thought, but not for long, for another word flashed in his head. Stupid. He couldn't be in Yalta. In the meantime, Rimsky did the following. He neatly folded all the telegrams and his own text into a stack, placed the stack in an envelope, sealed it, wrote a few words on it, and handed it to Varyonika, saying, "Take it you-know-where right now, Ivan Savayeevich, personally. Let them sort it out." Now that is truly smart, thought Varyonika, placing the envelope in his briefcase. Then, just in case, he dialed Stiopa's home number one last time, listened carefully, and then began to wink and grimace mysteriously and happily. Rimsky craned his neck. "Could I speak to the artist Woland, please?" Varyonika asked sweetly. "They're busy," came a rattling voice from the receiver. "Who is this?" "Varyonika, manager of the Variety." "Ivan Savayeevich!" the receiver cried joyfully. "Terribly pleased to hear your voice. How are you?" "Merci," said Varyonika in astonishment. "And who am I speaking to?" His assistant and interpreter, Korovyov," the receiver sputtered. "Completely at your service, my dearest Ivan Savayeevich. Direct me as you please, so?" "Pardon me, but does Stefan Bogdanovich Likodiev happen to be home right now?" "Alas, no, the receiver cried. "He left." "Where to?" "For a drive in the country." "What? A drive? When's he coming back?" "He just said he'd go for a breath of fresh air and come right back." "Right," Varyonika said, at a loss. "Merci. If you would be so kind, please tell Monsieur Woland that his performance will be during the third segment today." "Got it, of course, right away, urgently, unquestionably, we'll relay the message," the receiver rapped out in staccato. "All the best, then," Varyonika said, puzzled. "Please accept," the receiver continued, "my finest, warmest greetings and wishes, success, luck, complete happiness, everything." "Well, of course I told you," the manager yelled excitedly. "Forget Yalta, he went for a drive in the country." "Well, if that's true," the financial director began, paling with hatred, "then there are no words to describe what a swine he is." Then the manager leaped in the air and shouted so loud that Rimsky flinched. I remember! They've just opened a Georgian diner in Pushkino, Yalta. It's obvious. He went there, got drunk, and started sending telegrams." "Well, that's just too much," Rimsky replied, his cheek twitching, sincere and grave hatred burning in his eyes. Fine, then. He'll pay dearly for this little excursion. Then he stumbled all of a sudden and added hesitantly, But wait, the criminal investigator. That's nonsense, his own little tricks, the effusive manager interrupted and asked, Shall I take the envelope anyway? Absolutely, Rimsky replied. The door opened again to reveal the same woman. It's her, Rimsky thought dismally, and they both rose to greet the postwoman. This time the telegram contained the words, Thanks. Confirmation. Urgently transfer 500 rubles via criminal investigator. Flying Moscow tomorrow. Likhoriev. He's gone mad, Varyonika said weakly. As for Rimsky, he jingled his key, took the money out of the fireproof safe, counted out 500 rubles, made a phone call, gave the money to a courier, and sent him to the telegraph office. Forgive me, Grigory Danilovich, Varyonika said, not believing his eyes. If you ask me, you shouldn't be sending the money. It will be returned, Rimsky replied quietly, but he will answer in full for this little picnic. And pointing to Varyonika's briefcase, he added, Go, Ivan Savalyevich, don't delay. And Varyonika ran out of the office with his briefcase. He went down to the first floor, saw a very long line by the box office, and found out from the cashier that she expected the show to sell out within the hour, as people started pouring in the moment they saw the supplementary posters. He ordered the cashier to hold on to 30 of the best seats in the boxes and orchestra, jumped out of the box office, and, fighting off annoying free ticket hounds, dove into his office to grab his cap. Just then the phone rang. Yes, Varyonika shouted.
Ivan Savyeyevich?
The receiver inquired in a most repugnant nasal voice.
He's not in the theatre,
Varyonika began to yell, but the receiver interrupted immediately.
Don't fool around, Ivan Savyeyevich, but listen. Don't take the telegrams anywhere, and don't show them to anyone.
Who's this? Varyonika roared. Quit your tricks, mister. We'll straighten you out in a second. What's your number?
Varyonika,
the same disgusting voice replied.
Do you understand Russian? Do not take the telegrams anywhere.
Oh, so you won't desist? The manager screamed in a rage. Well, you just wait. You'll pay for this. He yelled some other threat, and then fell silent, sensing that no one at the other end was listening any more. Somehow, the office quickly grew dark. Varyonika ran out, slammed the door shut behind him, and headed out to the summer garden through a side door. The manager was excited and brimming with energy. After the insolent phone call, he had no doubt that it was some gang of hooligans out to play a few nasty tricks, and that these tricks were somehow connected to Likhodiev's disappearance. The manager was practically choking with desire to expose the villains, and strange as it sounds, he nursed an anticipation of something pleasant within him. This happens when a man seeks to become the centre of attention, to break some sensational news somewhere. The wind in the garden blew sand in the manager's face, as if blocking his path, as if forewarning him. Somewhere on the second floor, a window pane slammed so hard that the glass almost flew out, and the tops of the maples and lindens rustled alarmingly. It grew darker and fresher. The manager rubbed his eyes and saw a low-hanging, yellow-bellied storm cloud crawling over Moscow. A dense rumble came from the distance. However great Varyonika's hurry, an irresistible impulse made him drop by the summer restroom for a second, to check whether the electrician had placed a wire mesh over the lamp. Running past the shooting gallery, Varyonika came to the dense lilac growth that surrounded the light-blue restroom building. The electrician turned out to be a competent man, and the lamp under the roof of the men's section had already been wrapped in metal netting, However, the manager was upset by the fact that, even in the pre-storm dusk, it was possible to see that the walls had already been written on with charcoal and pencil. "Oh, what the—" the manager began, and then heard a voice behind him purr.
"Is that you, Ivan Savalyevich?"
Varyonika gave a start, turned around, and saw a short, fat man standing behind him. The man's face looked oddly feline. "Yeah, it's me," Varyonika replied unpleasantly. "Very, very pleased," the cat-like fatso replied in a squeaky voice, and taking a sudden swing, he punched Varyonika in the ear so hard that the cap flew off the manager's head, disappearing without a trace in the toilet. The fat man's blow caused the entire restroom to light up with shaky light for a moment, and thunder followed from the sky. Another flash came, and a second man appeared before the manager. Short, but with an athletic build, fiery red hair, a fang protruding from his mouth, and a walleye. This second one was apparently a lefty, for he dealt the manager another one in the left ear. Again the sky rumbled in response, and a rainstorm came crashing down on the wooden roof of the restroom. "But, comrade," whispered the flabbergasted manager. Immediately realising that the words "comrades" was not at all appropriate for bandits attacking a man in a public restroom, he rasped, "Folks!" figured out that this new title was likewise undeserved, and received a third blow that sent blood gushing from his nose onto his shirt, although he could not tell which of the two it came from. "What's in the briefcase, parasite?" the one resembling a cat shouted piercingly. "Telegrams? And weren't you warned over the phone not to take them anywhere? I'm asking you, weren't you warned?" "I was warned," the manager replied, gasping. "And you ran anyway? Hand over the case, vermin!" The second man cried in the same nasal voice that had spoken earlier from the phone, and tore the briefcase out of Varyonika's shaking hands. Together they took the manager under the arms, dragged him out of the garden, and dashed off down Sadovaya. The thunderstorm raged in full force. Rumbling, howling water plummeted through sewer gratings. Waves bubbled and swelled everywhere. Streams poured from roofs, missing the drain pipes, and foaming currents rushed from gateways. All that lived had been washed off Sadovaya, and there was no one left to rescue Ivan Savalyevich. Leaping over the muddy rivers, amid flashes of lightning, the bandits hauled the half-dead manager to number 302B in mere seconds, and flew through the gate, where two barefoot women were huddling by the wall, holding their shoes and stockings in their hands. They dashed towards the sixth entrance, and Varyonika, now close to madness, was taken up to the fifth landing and thrown down on the floor in Styopa Lichodiev's familiar hall. Here, both villains vanished, and instead there appeared in the hall a completely naked girl, a redhead with flaming phosphorescent eyes. Varyonika realised that this was the most terrible of all that was happening to him, and shrank back against the wall, moaning. The girl walked right up to the manager and placed the palms of her hands on his shoulders. Varyonika's hair stood on end, for even through the cold, water-soaked fabric of his shirt, he felt her palms to be far colder, as cold as ice itself. "Let me give you a kiss," the girl said tenderly, and her shining eyes appeared right in front of his own. Then Varyonika lost consciousness and did not feel the kiss. Chapter 11. A Rift in Ivan. Illuminated by the May sun not 1 hour ago, the forest on the far bank of the river had now dimmed, blurred, and dissolved. Water fell in a solid wall outside the window. Flashing threads of lightning cracked the sky every now and then, flooding the patient's room with frightening, quivering light. Sitting on his bed, and watching the muddy river boil over with bubbles, Ivan wept quietly. At every thunderclap he would cry out miserably and cover his face with his hands. Sheets of paper full of Ivan's writing lay on the floor. They had been blown all over the place by the wind that burst into the room just before the storm. The poet's attempt to write a statement about the horrible consultant did not lead anywhere. As soon as he received a pencil stub and some paper from the portly attendant, known as Praskovya Fyodorovna, he rubbed his hands together busily and quickly sidled up to the table. The beginning came out rather robustly. To the police, from Masolit member, Ivan Nikolaevich, homeless. Statement. Yesterday evening, I came to Patriarch's Ponds with the deceased M.A. Berlioz. And right away, the poet was thrown off, mostly on account of the word deceased. It sounded nonsensical. How could he have come with a deceased man? The deceased do not walk. They were liable to really take him for a madman. Thinking along these lines, Ivan Nikolaevich began to correct what he had written. This resulted in, with M.A. Berlioz, thereafter deceased, which did not please the author either. He was forced to produce a third version, which turned out even worse than the first two. Berlioz, who fell under a tram. And then that irrelevant composer with the same last name got stuck in his head, and he had to insert, not the composer. Tormented by these two Berliozes, Ivan crossed everything out and decided to begin with something very striking to immediately capture the reader's attention. He wrote first about how the cat tried to board the tram, and then returned to the episode involving the severed head. The head and the consultant's prediction led him to Pontius Pilate, and, for added credibility, Ivan decided to recount the entire tale about the procurator from the moment the man emerged onto the colonnade of Herod's palace in a white cape with blood-red lining. Ivan worked diligently, crossing out his writing and adding new words, and even attempted to draw Pontius Pilate, and then the cat walking on hind paws. But the drawings did not help either, and the further along he went, the more jumbled and incomprehensible the poet's statement became. By the time the frightening storm cloud with smoky edges appeared from afar and covered the forest, by the time the wind blew in, Ivan felt that he was exhausted, that he could not conquer the statement. He did not pick up the scattered sheets, but instead began to cry quietly and bitterly. The kind-hearted attendant, Praskovya Fyodorovna, came by to check on the poet during the storm. Seeing him crying, she grew worried, closed the blinds so that the thunderbolts would not frighten the patient, picked up the sheets from the floor, and ran with them to the doctor. The latter appeared, gave Ivan a shot in the arm, and assured him that he would not cry any more, that everything would get better, everything would change, and everything would be forgotten. The doctor was right. Soon, the faraway forest stood as before, clearly painted down to the last tree, on a backdrop of sky that cleared up to its usual perfect blue. The river calmed down as well. Ivan's sorrow began to leave him immediately after the shot, and now the poet lay calmly on his bed and looked at the rainbow that draped over the sky. This went on until evening, and he did not even notice how the rainbow had melted, how the sky had saddened and faded, how the forest grew black. After a drink of hot milk, Ivan lay down again and was amazed at how his thought process had changed. The accursed demonic cat blurred somehow in his memory, and the severed head no longer frightened him. Abandoning all thoughts of it, Ivan came to contemplate that, in fact, it was quite decent here at the clinic, that Stravinsky was a smart and famous guy, and that it was very pleasant to deal with him. On top of that, the evening air was sweeter and fresher after the storm. The house of sorrow was falling asleep. The white frosted glass lights in the hallways were turned off and replaced, according to regulation, with dim blue night lights. The attendant's careful steps on the rubber mats of the hallway came less and less frequently. Ivan now lay in sweet lethargy. glancing sometimes at the shaded lamp pouring soft light from the ceiling, sometimes at the moon rising from the black forest, and talked to himself. Why, come to think of it, did I get so upset over Berlioz falling under the tram? Mused the poet. To the junk heap with him already. What am I, his buddy or his in-law? If we drill this question properly, it turns out I never actually knew the deceased too well. After all, what did I know about him? Absolutely nothing, except that he was bald and horribly articulate. And furthermore, gentlemen, Ivan continued his speech to an unseen audience, let's examine something here. Why did I, if you'd be so kind as to tell me, get so mad at that mysterious consultant, magician, and professor with the empty black eye? Why, the senseless chase in the long johns, candle in hand, and then all that crazy mishmash at the restaurant? But, the old Ivan said sternly to the new Ivan from somewhere, perhaps from inside, perhaps into his ear. He knew in advance that Berlioz would get his head chopped off after all. How could one not get worried? What's to speak of, comrades? The new Ivan objected to the ancient former one. Even a child could tell there was something odd going on. That character was 100% unusual and mysterious. But then again, that's the most interesting thing. The man personally knew Pontius Pilate. What could be more interesting than that? And instead of raising that stupid disturbance on the patriarchs, wouldn't it have been smarter to ask him politely what happened afterwards to Pilate and that prisoner, Hard-Not-Three? And instead, I started doing hell knows what. Big deal, really. A journal editor gets run over. What, will the journal shut down or something? Well, what can you do? Man is mortal and, as it was very justly said, unexpectedly mortal. May he rest in peace. Another editor will come, perhaps even more articulate than the first. After dozing off briefly, the new Ivan asked the old Ivan derisively, So what does that make me, then? A fool, a low voice said clearly from somewhere, belonging to neither of the Ivans and strikingly resembling that of the consultant. For some reason, Ivan was not at all offended at being called a fool, but even pleasantly surprised. He sniggered and fell silent, only half awake. Sleep stole towards Ivan, and he was already imagining a palm tree with an elephantine trunk and a cat passing by. Not a scary, but a happy one. In other words, a second more and sleep would engulf him. Then suddenly, the window grating slid noiselessly aside, and a mysterious figure appeared on the balcony, hiding from the moonlight, and shook a finger at Ivan. Unafraid, Ivan raised himself on the bed and saw that a man was standing on the balcony. And pressing a finger to his lips, the man whispered, "Shh." Chapter 12. Black Magic and its Exposure. A small man, with a pear-shaped red nose, wearing a yellow bowler with holes, checked trousers and patent leather boots, rode out onto the varieties stage on an ordinary two-wheeled bicycle. To the sound of the foxtrot, he described a circle and then let out a triumphant yelp, causing the bicycle to rear up. Riding on the back wheel alone, the man flipped upside down, managed to screw off the front wheel on the go and send it off into the wings, and continued his journey on one wheel, pushing the pedals with his hands. A stout blonde emerged on a tall metal pole with a seat on top and a single wheel at the bottom, wearing tights and a small skirt sprinkled with silver stars, and began to ride around in a circle. Whenever he encountered her, the little man would let out hoots of greeting and lift the bowler from his head with his foot. Finally, an 8-year-old kid with an aged face rolled out and began to dart between the adults on a tiny two-wheeler fixed with a gigantic car horn. After several such loops, the entire crew rolled right up to the edge of the stage to an anxious drum roll from the orchestra. The spectators in the front row gasped and recoiled, for it seemed all three would crash into the orchestra pit along with their contraptions. But the bike stopped just as the front wheels were threatening to slip off into the void and onto the musicians' heads. With a loud cry of "Hup!" the cyclists hopped off the vehicles and bowed, the blonde blowing kisses to the audience and the kid playing a funny tune on his horn. Applause shook the building. Blue curtains moved in from the sides and covered the cyclists, green exit signs by the doors extinguished, and white spheres lit up like suns in the trapeze web under the dome of the roof. It was the intermission before the last segment. The only man who was not the least bit interested in the wonders of cycling technique exhibited by the Giulli family was Grigory Danilovich Rimsky. He sat in his office in complete solitude, biting his thin lips, a spasm passing over his face every now and then. Lichodeyev's incredible disappearance had been compounded by the completely unforeseen disappearance of the manager, Varyonika. Rimsky knew where the man had gone to, but he'd gone and never come back. Rimsky shrugged his shoulders and whispered to himself, "But what did they get him for?" And here is what was strange. Nothing would have been easier for a professional like the financial director than to call where Varyonika had gone to and find out what had happened to him. And yet until 10 o'clock in the evening, Rimsky could not force himself to do it. At 10, he practically bullied himself into taking the receiver off the hook and found out that the phone was dead. A messenger informed him that all the other phones in the building were malfunctioning. This unpleasant, but by no means supernatural occurrence shocked the financial director finally and completely, but pleased him at the same time. There was no longer a need to call. When a red light lit up and began to blink over the financial director's head, informing him of the onset of intermission, a messenger walked in and told him that the foreign artist had arrived. The financial director shuddered for some reason, and, growing darker than a storm cloud, went out to the wings to greet the visiting performer, because there was no one else left to do it. Under various pretexts, curious folk peeked into the large dressing room from the corridor, where signal bells were already ringing. There were magicians in bright robes and turbans, a skater in a knitted white jacket, a storyteller, his face white with powder, and the make-up man. The arriving celebrity stunned everybody with his wondrously cut, remarkably long tailcoat, and the fact that he wore a black half-mask. But most amazing of all were the black magician's 2 companions, a tall, checkered fellow in a cracked pince-nez, and a fat black cat, who, upon entering the dressing-room on hind paws, sat down very casually on the couch and squinted at the unshielded make-up lights. Rimsky attempted to show a smile on his face, which had the effect of making him look mean and sour, and bowed to the silent magician sitting on the couch next to the cat. There was no handshake. However, the nonchalant checkered man personally introduced himself to the financial director as an assistant of theirs. This circumstance surprised the financial director, once again unpleasantly, for there was positively no mention of any assistants in the contract. Most uncomfortably and dryly, Grigory Danilovich inquired of the out-of-the-blue checkered man where the artist's equipment was. "Our heavenly diamond, most precious Sir Director," the magician's assistant replied in a rattling voice. "Our equipment is always with us. Here it is. 1, 2, 3. And, flicking his knotty fingers in front of Rimsky's eyes, he reached suddenly behind the cat's ear and pulled out Rimsky's own gold watch and chain, which had previously been in the financial director's waistcoat pocket. beneath a buttoned jacket, with the chain strung through a buttonhole. Rimsky clutched his stomach reflexively. All those present gasped, and the make-up man, looking through the door, grunted his approval. "Your watch, please accept," the checkered one said, smiling insolently, and handed the confused Rimsky his possession with a dirty hand. "Don't sit next to this one on a tram," the storyteller whispered quietly and cheerfully to the make-up man. But the cat pulled a stunt that put the stolen watch completely in the shade. Rising suddenly from the couch, he approached the dressing table on hind paws, removed the stopper from the carafe with his front, poured some water into a glass, drank it, replaced the stopper, and wiped his whiskers with a make-up cloth. This time, no one gasped. They merely stood with their mouths open, while the make-up man exclaimed in awe, "First rate!" The bells rang anxiously for the third time, and everyone piled out of the dressing-room, excited and anticipating an interesting performance. A minute later, the spheres inside the theatre extinguished, the footlights lit up and cast a reddish glow on the bottom of the curtain, and in the illuminated gap between the curtain halves there appeared before the audience a plump, clean-shaven fellow, gleeful as a child, his tailcoat crumpled and his shirt not quite fresh, well known to all of Moscow. It was the MC, George Bengalski.
"And so, ladies and gentlemen,"
Bengalski began with a babyish smile.
"you are about to see—"
Here Bengalski interrupted himself and spoke in a different tone. "I see the audience has grown even larger in time for the third segment. We got half the city here today. The other day, I met a friend of mine, and I said to him, 'Why don't you ever come by? We had half the city over yesterday.' And he said, 'I live in the other half.'" Bengalski paused, waiting for a burst of laughter, but as no one laughed, he continued.
"And so, you are about to see a famous foreign artist, Monsieur Woland, and his séance of black magic. Now, you and I certainly understand,"
here Bengalski smiled a knowing smile,
"that there's no such thing in the world, and that it's nothing more than superstition. Maestro Woland has simply achieved a higher mastery of various trick techniques, which will become evident in the most interesting part of the performance, or, more specifically, the exposure of these techniques. And since we're all eager for both the techniques and the exposure, let us welcome Sir Woland."
Having spewed all this drivel, Bengalski clasped the palms of his hands together and waved them amicably at the gap in the curtain, causing the halves to slide apart with a quiet rustle. The magician's entrance, along with his tall assistant and the cat, who walked on stage on hind paws, delighted the audience greatly. "An armchair for me," Woland ordered quietly, and that very second an armchair appeared on stage out of nowhere and by unknown means, and the magician sat in it. "Tell me, dear fagot," Woland inquired of the checkered hack, who evidently went by another name besides Korovyov. "Tell me, would you say that Moscow's population has changed significantly?" The magician glanced at the silent audience, which was stunned by the armchair's appearance out of thin air. "Quite so, Messiah," Fagot Korovyov replied quietly. "You are right. The citizens have changed a lot, in their look, I mean. As did the city itself, though. The clothing goes without saying, but now there are all these, what do you call them? Trams, cars." "Buses," Fagot prompted politely. The audience took in this conversation carefully, believing it to be a prelude to the magic. The wings were packed with actors and stagehands, Rimsky's tense, pale face among them. Bengalski's face began to express confusion as he huddled at the side of the stage. He raised his eyebrow ever so slightly, and, taking advantage of the pause, began,
"The foreign artist expresses his admiration for Moscow, which has grown in a technological sense, and also for the Muscovites."
Bengalski smiled twice, first at the orchestra and then at the gallery. Woland, Fagot, and the cat turned their heads in the MC's direction. "Did I express admiration?" the magician asked Fagot.
"Not at all, Messiah. You expressed nothing of the sort,"
the latter replied. "So what is that man talking about?"
"Oh, he just lied,"
the checkered assistant loudly informed the entire theatre, and, turning to Bengalski, added,
"Allow me to congratulate you, mister. You just lied."
A light snigger came from the gallery, while Bengalski flinched and his eyes bulged. "But of course, I am not so much interested in all these buses and telephones and other."
"Gadgets,"
suggested the checkered man. "Quite right, thank you." The magician spoke slowly, in a heavy bass. "What interests me is a far more important consideration. Have these citizens changed inside?"
"Yes, it is a most important question, sir."
Those in the wings began to exchange looks and shrug their shoulders. Bengalski was bright red, and Rimsky was pale. But then, as if sensing the brewing distress, the magician said, "However, we have digressed, my dear Fagot, while the audience grows bored. Show us something simple to begin with." The theatre shifted with relief. Fagot and the cat went to opposite sides of the stage. Fagot snapped his fingers and gave a boisterous cry of,
"A 1 and a 2.
He took a deck of cards right out of the air, shuffled it, and sent it flying in a ribbon towards the cat. The cat intercepted the ribbon and sent it back. The satin serpent snorted. Fagot opened his mouth like a baby bird, and card after card swallowed it all. Following this, the cat bowed, shuffling his feet, and won tremendous applause.
"First rate, first rate,"
came rapturous shouts from the wings. Then Fagot jabbed his finger at the orchestra and announced,
"This deck, dear ladies and gentlemen, is now located in the 7th row in the pocket of Mr. Barchevsky, right between a 3-ruble note and a court summons regarding alimony payments to Madame Zelkova."
The orchestra stirred, people began to rise, and finally some man named precisely Barchevsky, all purple with amazement, extracted the deck from his wallet and began waving it around, unsure of what to do with it.
"Keep it as a memento,"
Fagot cried.
"No wonder you said at dinner last night that, were it not for poker, your life in Moscow would be completely unbearable."
"Old hat," came from the gallery. "The one in the orchestra is part of the same gang."
"You think so?"
Fagot bellowed, squinting at the gallery.
"In that case, you're part of the gang too, because now it's in your pocket."
There was movement in the gallery, and a happy voice said,
"True! He's got it! It's here! It's here! Wait! But these are 10s!"
Those sitting in the orchestra turned their heads. Some confused gentleman in the gallery found a stack of notes in his pocket, wrapped by the bank and labelled 1,000 rubles. His neighbours pressed around him as he picked at the wrapper with his fingernail in astonishment, trying to find out if the 10s were real or some sort of magic ones.
"By God, they're real 10s!"
People screamed happily from the gallery.
"I wouldn't mind a game with that sort of deck,"
a fat man in the middle of the orchestra requested cheerfully.
"Avec plaisir,"
Fagot replied.
But why you alone? Everyone can join in. He commanded, I ask you to please look up. 1. A pistol appeared in his hand, and he shouted, 2. The pistol rose up in the air. He shouted, 3. And there was a flash, a crash, and white pieces of paper instantly began to fall from under the dome of the theatre, weaving between the trapezes. They whirled around, they were blown all over, they crowded above the gallery and drifted over the orchestra pit and the stage. In a few seconds, growing thicker and thicker, the money rain reached the seats, and the spectators began to catch the pieces of paper. Hundreds of arms rose up. Spectators held the notes to the light coming from the stage and beheld authentic, honest-to-God watermarks. The smell also left little doubt, incomparable in its pleasantness. It was the smell of freshly printed money. First joy, then awe took over the whole theatre. The words, tens, tens, buzzed everywhere, amid exclamations of, oh, oh, and joyful laughter. Some were already crawling around in the aisle, rummaging under the seats. Many stood on the seats, catching the whirly, unpredictable banknotes. The faces of the policemen on duty gradually became puzzled, while the actors began to peek out unceremoniously from the wings. A voice came from the dress circle. What are you grabbing at? It's mine. It was flying towards me. And then another. Stop shoving or I'll give you a good shove myself. Then came the sound of a slap. A policeman's helmet appeared immediately in the dress circle. Someone from the dress circle was led out. The general excitement grew, and no one knows what all of this would have led to had Fagot not stopped the money rain by blowing suddenly into the air. Exchanging meaningful, happy looks, 2 young men rose from their seats and made straight for the bar. A din persisted in the theatre. The eyes of all the spectators glittered with excitement. Yes, no one knows what all of this would have led to, had Bengalski not found the strength to move. Trying to compose himself, he rubbed his hands habitually and began in his most resonant voice. Here, ladies and gentlemen, we have just seen an instance of so-called mass hypnosis, a simple scientific demonstration best serving to show that miracles and magic do not exist. Let us ask Maestro Woland to expose this demonstration. You will now see, folks, how these alleged monetary notes disappear just as suddenly as they appeared. He began to applaud, quite alone, with a confident smile playing on his face. There was absolutely no confidence in his eyes, however, but instead something more like a plea. The audience did not like Bengalski's speech. Complete silence fell, and then was interrupted by the checkered Fagot. This is again an instance of so-called fibbing, he announced in a loud, goatish tenor. The bills are genuine, folks. Bravo! A low voice barked abruptly somewhere above. By the way, this one here, Fagot pointed at Bengalski, is getting on my nerves, always sticking his nose where no one's asking him to, disrupting the séance with false commentary. What should we do with him? Rip his head off, someone said sternly in the gallery. What did you say, huh? Fagot responded instantly to the crude suggestion. Rip his head off? Now there's an idea, Behemoth. He yelled to the cat. Do it! 1, 2, 3. And then a remarkable thing happened. The black cat's fur stood on end, and he gave a shrill meow. Compressing himself into a ball, he leapt straight onto Bengalski's chest like a panther, and then climbed onto his head. Grunting, the cat sank his plump paws into the MC's thinning hair, and with a savage howl,
twisted the head off its fat neck in 2 turns. 2,500 people in the theatre joined voices in a single scream. Fountains of blood surged from the severed arteries of the neck and spilled onto the tailcoat and shirt front. The headless body picked up its feet awkwardly and sat down on the floor. Hysterical women's cries came from the audience. The cat handed the head to Fagot, who lifted it by the hair and showed it to the public. And this head screamed desperately at the entire theatre. "Call a doctor! Are you going to spew any more nonsense in the future?" Fagot asked the weeping head menacingly. "I won't," croaked the head. "For God's sake, don't torture him!" A woman's voice came suddenly from a box seat, rising over the clamour, and the magician turned his head in the direction of this voice. "So how about it, folks? Shall we forgive him?" Fagot asked of the audience. "Forgive him! Forgive him!" came scattered and mostly women's voices at first, and then merged in chorus with the men's. "What are your orders, Messiah?" Fagot asked the masked man. "Well," the latter replied pensively, "people are people. They like money, but then again, they always did. Mankind loves money, whether made of leather, paper, bronze, or gold. So they're thoughtless. Well, what of it? And mercy knocks at their heart's door sometimes. Ordinary people, reminiscent of the old ones generally. Only the housing problem has corrupted them." And he ordered loudly, "Put the head back on." Taking careful aim, the cat slapped the head on the neck, and it fell precisely into place, as if it had never left. Moreover, not even a scar remained. The cat brushed over Bengalski's tailcoat and shirt front with his paws, and the bloodstains disappeared. Fagot lifted the sitting Bengalski to his feet, shoved a wad of tens in his tailcoat pocket, and led him off stage with the words, "Get lost! More fun without you!" Looking round senselessly and staggering, the MC only managed to reach the fire station before he became unwell. "My head! My head!" he cried out miserably. Rimsky and the others dashed towards him. The MC wept, grasped for something in the air with his hands, and muttered, "Give me back my head! Give it back! Take the apartment, take the paintings, just give me back my head!" A messenger ran for a doctor. The rest attempted to lay Bengalski down on a couch in the dressing-room, but he began to struggle and became unruly. An ambulance had to be called. After the unfortunate MC had been taken away, Rimsky ran back to the stage and beheld new wonders. By the way, perhaps it was at that time, or a little earlier, but the magician disappeared from the stage, along with his faded armchair. However, the audience did not notice this at all, distracted by the extraordinary things unfolding on stage, courtesy of Fagot. Having dispatched the injured MC, Fagot said this to the audience. "Now that we've sent the pest packing, let's open up a ladies' boutique." Instantly, the stage floor was covered in Persian rugs. Giant mirrors sprang up, lit from the sides by green tubes, and between the mirrors, the happily astonished audience beheld display windows full of Parisian women's dresses of various cuts and colours. These appeared in some of the displays, while others showed off hundreds of hats, with feathers and lacking feathers, with buckles and without, and hundreds of shoes, black, white, yellow, leather, satin, suede, with straps, with gems. Perfume cases materialized among the shoes, the shiny facets of the crystal bottles playing in the light. There were mountains of handbags made of antelope hide, suede and silk, and amid these lay whole piles of little elongated golden cylinders, such as usually contain lipstick. Hell knows where from, a red-headed girl in a black evening gown popped up near the displays and smiled a proprietor's smile. A fine girl in all respects. Were she not marred by an odd scar on her neck? Grinning sweetly, Fagot declared that his firm would provide absolutely free exchanges of old ladies' dresses and footwear for the latest Parisian models and Parisian footwear. He added that the same went for the handbags, the perfume, and the rest. The cat began to shuffle his rear paw, while using his front to make gestures that became a doorman opening a door. A little hoarsely, but sweetly nonetheless, the girl began to drawlingly sing out something cryptic, and, judging by the faces of the women in the orchestra, very tantalizing. Guerlain, Chanel No. 5, Mitso au cul, Narcisse Noir, evening gowns, cocktail dresses. Fagot weaved around. The cat bowed. The girl opened up the display windows. "Please," Fagot bellowed. "No embarrassment, no formalities." The audience was excited, but no one yet dared to go on stage. Finally, some brunette stepped out of the 10th row of the orchestra and, smiling as if to say that, it was all the same to her and she positively did not give a damn, went up the side ramp to the stage. "Bravo!" Fagot exclaimed. "Welcome to our first customer. Behemoth, a chair. Let's begin with the shoes, madam." The brunette sat down on the chair, and Fagot poured out a whole heap of shoes on the carpet before her. The brunette took off her right shoe and tried on a new lilac one. She stamped her foot on the carpet and looked over the heel. "They won't pinch, will they?" she asked pensively. Come now, a hurt Fagot exclaimed, while the cat meowed resentfully. "I'll take this pair, monsieur," the brunette said with dignity, putting on the second shoe. The brunette's old shoes were tossed behind a curtain, where she herself followed, accompanied by the red-headed girl and Fagot, the latter carrying several fashionable dresses on hangers. The cat fussed about and helped, draping measuring tape over his neck for added appearance. A minute later, the brunette emerged from behind the curtain in a dress that made the entire orchestra gasp. Rendered remarkably prettier, the brave woman stopped by the mirror, wriggled her bare shoulders, touched her hair around the nape of her neck, and contorted, trying to get a look at her back. "The company asks you to accept a souvenir," Fagot said, handing her an open perfume case with a bottle inside. "Merci," the brunette said haughtily, and descended the ramp to the orchestra. As she walked, spectators leapt up to touch the perfume case. Then everything broke loose, and women came on stage from all directions. Amid the general excited clamour, sniggers, and sighs, came a male voice, "I won't let you," and a female one, "You are a despot and a Philistine, stop hurting my arm." Women disappeared behind the curtain, left their dresses there, and emerged in new ones. An entire row of ladies sat upon gold-legged stools, energetically stamping their newly shod feet into the carpet. Fagot went down on his knees, manipulating a shoehorn. The cat, swooning under piles of handbags and shoes, dragged himself from the displays to the stools and back again. The girl with the mangled neck appeared and disappeared, reaching the point where she prattled on solely in French. Most surprisingly, all the women managed to understand her every word, including those who did not know the slightest bit of the French language. To everyone's amazement, a man squeezed into the crowd on stage. He announced that his wife had the flu and that he would like to accept something on her behalf. To prove that he was actually married, the man was willing to present his passport. The caring husband's statement was met with laughter, Fagot yelled that he believed him like he believed his own self, and handed the man 2 pairs of silk stockings, while the cat added a small lipstick case from himself. The latecomers ripped onto the stage, while the lucky ones poured off it dressed in ballroom gowns, pyjamas with ornate dragons, serious business suits, hats tipped over one eyebrow. Then Fagot announced that due to the late hour, the store would close until the next evening in exactly 1 minute. And unbelievable turmoil ensued on stage. Women grabbed hastily at shoes without any attempt to try them on. One of them burst behind the curtain in a storm, threw off her suit, and took possession of the first item that came to hand, a silk robe covered in gigantic flowers, while also managing to snatch up 2 perfume cases. Exactly 1 minute later, a pistol shot rang out, the mirrors disappeared, the displays and the stools fell through the floor, and the rugs dissolved in thin air, along with the curtain. The tall mountain of old dresses and shoes was the last to disappear, and the stage again became sombre, empty, and bare. And then a new character got involved. A pleasant, loud, and very insistent baritone came from box number 2. "It would nonetheless be desirable, Mr. Artist, if you would reveal to the spectators the techniques behind your tricks without delay, particularly the one with the paper money. The MC's return to the stage is equally desirable. The audience is worried about his fate." The baritone belonged to none other than the evening's guest of honour, Arkady Apollonovich Sempelyarov, chairman of the Acoustics Commission of Moscow theatres. Arkady Apollonovich was situated in a box with 2 ladies, one middle-aged, dressed fashionably and expensively, and the other young and pretty, dressed more plainly. The first of these, as was soon afterwards determined at the drafting of the police report, was Arkady Apollonovich's wife, and the second, a distant relative of his, an aspiring actress with promise, who had come from Saratov and taken residence in the apartment belonging to Arkady Apollonovich and his wife.
"Pardon?" Fagot replied. "Forgive me, but there's nothing to reveal here. Everything's clear."
"No, excuse me. An exposure is absolutely necessary. Without it, your spectacular numbers will leave a daunting impression. The masses demand an explanation."
"The masses,"
the impudent hack interrupted,
"did not appear to be demanding anything last time I checked. But, taking into account your most respectable wishes, Arkady Apollonovich, I'll have it your way. Perform an exposure. But for this purpose, would you permit one more tiny little number?"
"Why not?" Arkady Apollonovich replied patronisingly. "But it must have an exposure."
"Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So then, allow me to ask you where you were last night, Arkady Apollonovich."
At this inappropriate, perhaps even rude question, Arkady Apollonovich's face changed, and quite significantly. "Last night, Arkady Apollonovich was at a meeting of the Acoustics Commission," Arkady Apollonovich's wife declared very haughtily. "But I do not understand how this relates to the magic."
"Oui, madame. Naturally you do not understand,"
Fagot agreed.
"You are quite mistaken about the meeting. Having left for the aforementioned meeting, which, in passing, was not even scheduled for yesterday, Arkady Apollonovich dismissed his driver by the building of the Acoustics Commission on the pristine ponds."
The entire theatre fell silent.
"Then took the bus to Yelohovskaya Street to visit an actress of the regional travelling theatre, Militsa Andreevna Pokobatko, and spent about 4 hours there."
"Oi!" someone exclaimed miserably in the absolute silence. As for Arkady Apollonovich's young relative, she suddenly burst out in a low, frightening laughter. "It's all clear now," she exclaimed. "I've long suspected it. Now I can see why that untalented ham got the part of Louisa." And, taking a sudden swing with her short, thick, violet umbrella, she smacked Arkady Apollonovitch on the head. The conniving fagot, also Korovyov, cried,
"This, dear ladies and gentlemen, is one example of exposure that Arkady Apollonovitch so doggedly demanded."
"How dare you lay a hand on Arkady Apollonovitch, you strumpet?" Arkady Apollonovitch's wife asked menacingly, rising in the box to all of her gargantuan height. A short second bout of satanic laughter seized the young relative. "Who else dares?" she replied, chortling, "if not me?" And for the second time there came the dry crack of the umbrella as it bounced off Arkady Apollonovitch's head. "Police! Seize her!" Sempelyarov's wife shouted in a voice so terrible that many felt a chill in their hearts. And then the cat leapt out to the footlights and barked suddenly in a human voice for the whole theatre to hear. "The séance is over! Maestro, a march!" Scarcely aware of his own actions, the crazed conductor waved his baton, and the orchestra did not start to play, nor even strike up, nor even slam into, but precisely in tune with the cat's repugnant expression, scraped out an unbelievable, exceptionally shameless march. For a split second it brought on memories of a café chantant under the southern stars, where the incomprehensible, half-blind, but rowdy lyrics to this march might have once been heard. His Excellency had a thing for cute domestic birds, but also took under his wing a few attractive skirts. Or perhaps these lyrics never existed. Perhaps there were others to the same music, some far more indecent ones. It's not important. What's important is that afterwards it was as if the Tower of Babel had collapsed in the variety. The police ran to the Sempelyarov's box, the curious went climbing over the barriers, and hellish bursts of laughter, interspersed with feral cries, came from all directions, drowned out only by the golden clash of cymbals in the orchestra. And one could see that the stage emptied suddenly, and that the swindler fagot, along with the shameless cat behemoth, vanished into thin air, disappearing just as the magician and his faded armchair did earlier. Chapter 13. Enter the Hero. And so the unknown man shook his finger at Ivan and whispered, "Shh." Ivan lowered his legs from the bed and peered into the darkness. A man of about 38 years of age was peeking in cautiously from the balcony. Clean-shaven, dark-haired, sharp-nosed, with troubled eyes and a curl of hair hanging down on his forehead. After making sure that Ivan was alone and listening intently, the mysterious visitor gained confidence and stepped into the room. Here Ivan saw that the new arrival was dressed in hospital garb. He was wearing underclothes, slippers on his bare feet, and a brown robe thrown over his shoulders. The visitor winked at Ivan, replaced a bunch of keys in his pocket, and inquired in a whisper, "May I sit?" Receiving an affirmative nod, he settled in a chair. "How did you get here?" Ivan asked in a whisper, obeying the dry finger. "Aren't the balcony gratings locked?" "The gratings are locked," the guest confirmed. "However, Praskovya Fyodorovna is a very sweet but, alas, absent-minded person. I stole a bunch of keys from her a month ago, and thus gained the ability to go out on the common balcony, which stretches around the entire floor. Thus, I can visit a neighbour every now and then.
If you can get out on the balcony, you can take off. Or is it too high?
Ivan wondered. No, the guest replied firmly. I cannot take off. Not because it's too high, but because I have nowhere to take off to. And after a pause he added, So, here we are. Here we are, Ivan replied, looking into the visitor's very anxious brown eyes. Oh yes, the guest grew worried all of a sudden. You're not a violent one, I hope, because, you know, I just can't stand noise, commotion, violence, things like that. I despise human cries in particular, be they cries of suffering, rage, or any other kind. Reassure me. Tell me you're not violent. Yesterday, in a restaurant, I walloped this one guy in the mug, the transformed poet admitted bravely. Cause? The guest asked sternly. Well, to tell you the truth, without any real cause, Ivan replied, embarrassed. Disgraceful, the guest rebuked Ivan and added, Besides, what's with these expressions? Walloped in the mug? You can't say for sure whether a person possesses a mug or a face, and it's probably a face, so using your fists, you know. No, you just drop this stuff once and for all. Having reprimanded Ivan in this fashion, the guest inquired, Occupation? Poet, Ivan said reluctantly. The visitor became upset. Oh, lousy luck, he exclaimed, but caught himself immediately, apologised, and asked, And what's your name? Homeless. Oh, the guest said, cringing. So you don't like my poems? Ivan asked with curiosity. I dislike them terribly. And which ones have you read? I haven't read any of your poems, the visitor exclaimed nervously. So how can you say that? Well, so what? The guest replied. As if I haven't read others. Then again, is this a miracle? Very well, I'm prepared to take your word for it. Tell me yourself, are your poems any good? They're monstrous, Ivan said all of a sudden with brave sincerity. Don't write any more, the guest beseeched him. I promise and swear, Ivan said solemnly. They sealed the oath with a handshake, and then light footsteps and voices came from the corridor. Shh! The guest whispered, and jumped out onto the balcony, closing the grating behind him. Praskovya Fyodorovna looked inside, asked Ivan how he felt, and whether he wished to sleep in the dark or in the light. Ivan requested that the light be left on, and Praskovya Fyodorovna left after wishing the patient a good night. And when everything quieted down, the guest returned. In a whisper, he relayed to Ivan that a new patient had just been delivered to room 119, some fat, purple-faced man who kept carrying on about foreign currency in the ventilation shafts and swearing that evil spirits had taken residence in his place on Sadovaya. Curses Pushkin for all he's worth and keeps screaming, Kuryesov, encore, encore, the guest narrated, twitching nervously. Calming down, he sat and spoke. Anyway, God be with him, and continued his conversation with Ivan. So why exactly did you end up here? Because of Pontius Pilate, Ivan replied, frowning at the floor. What? The guest cried, forgetting all caution, and clamped his own mouth with his hand. An amazing coincidence. I beg you, do tell. Feeling a strange sense of trust in the unknown man, Ivan began narrating yesterday's events at Patriarch's Ponds, hesitantly and timidly at first, and then with increasing confidence. Truly, Ivan Nikolaevich had acquired a grateful listener in the person of the mysterious key-thief. The guest did not make him out to be a madman, took the greatest interest in the story, and became absolutely delighted as it progressed. Again and again he would interrupt Ivan with exclamations. Well, go on, I beg you. Only please, in the name of all that's holy, don't leave anything out. Ivan did not leave anything out. for that made his storytelling easier, and gradually got to the part where Pontius Pilate stepped onto the balcony, wearing a white cape with blood-red lining. Here the guest clasped his hands as if in prayer and whispered, "Oh, how I knew it! How I had guessed it all!" The guest followed up the description of Berlioz's horrific death with a puzzling comment, his eyes flashing with malice. "The one thing I regret is that the critic Latunsky or the writer Mstislav Lavrovich could not have been in this Berlioz's place." And he cried ecstatically but noiselessly, "Go on!" The guest was extremely amused at the cat, who tried to pay the conductress, and shook with silent laughter as Ivan, excited at the success of his story, crouched and hopped about quietly, imitating the cat with a coin near his whiskers. "And so," Ivan concluded, growing sad and gloomy after relating the episode at Griboyedov, "I ended up here." The guest placed his hand sympathetically on the poor poet's shoulder and spoke thus. "Unfortunate poet, but you have only yourself to blame, dear boy. You can't be so casual and even insolent around him, so now you're paying the price, and you really ought to be thankful you got off rather cheaply." "So who is he already?" Ivan asked, shaking his fists in excitement. The guest peered at Ivan and answered with a question. "Now, you won't become agitated, will you? None of us are exactly reliable folk around here. No calling the doctor, no shots, none of that nonsense." "No, no," Ivan exclaimed. "Tell me, who is he?" "Very well," the guest replied, and enunciated authoritatively. "Yesterday, at Patriarch's Ponds, you met Satan." Ivan stuck to his promise and did not become agitated, but was nonetheless greatly flabbergasted. "It couldn't be. He does not exist." "Please, you of all people are one to talk. You were one of the first, it seems, who suffered by his hand. Here you are, as you can see, sitting in a psychiatric ward and still talking of how he doesn't exist. It's strange, frankly." Confused, Ivan fell silent. "From the moment you began to describe him," the guest continued, "I started to suspect just who it was you'd had the pleasure of chatting with yesterday. And really, I am surprised at Berlioz. Now you, of course, are a literary virgin." Here the guest apologised again. "But he, as far as I've heard, had at least read a few things. The very first words of this so-called professor scattered all my doubts. He's impossible to miss, my friend. Then again, you, please excuse me again, but unless I'm mistaken, you're a rather ignorant man, aren't you?" "Indubitably," an unrecognisable Ivan agreed. "So then, even the face that you described, different eyes and eyebrows. Pardon me, but perhaps you haven't even heard the opera Faust." Ivan grew frightfully embarrassed for some reason, and, with face aflame, began to prattle on about some trip to a Yalta resort. Right, unsurprising. But Berlioz, I say again, astounds me. A man not only well-read, but evidently quite shrewd. Though I must say in his defence that naturally Woland can pull the wool over a shrewder man's eyes." "What?" Ivan cried in turn. "Quiet!" Ivan gave himself a mighty smack on the forehead and rasped, "I get it! I get it! He had a W on his card! Ay, now that's something." In baffled silence, he stared at the moon floating beyond the window grating, and then said, "So, then, he really could have been at Pontius Pilate's. He had already been born then, hadn't he? And they call me crazy," he added, pointing at the door indignantly. A bitter frown appeared around the guest's lips. "Let's look truth in the face." The guest turned his head towards the nocturnal orb as it dashed through a cloud. "You and I are both insane. Why protest? You see, he had shaken you badly, and you went mad, for you evidently possess the prerequisites for that sort of thing. But that which you speak of undoubtedly did take place. Of course, it is so incredible that even Stravinsky, a brilliant psychiatrist, naturally failed to believe you. He examined you? Ivan nodded. Your companion has been at Pilate's. He's breakfasted with Kant. And now he has paid a visit to Moscow.
But he's going to stir up hell knows what around here. Shouldn't he be caught somehow?
Ivan's old, not quite beaten self reared its head unsurely within the new Ivan. You already tried, so that's enough for you, the guest replied sardonically. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else either. As for stirring things up, you can bet on it. Oh, but what a pity that it was you who met him and not I. Though all has burned and the coals are covered with ash, I swear I'd give Praskovia Fyodorovna's bundle of keys for such a meeting, for I have nothing else to give. I am destitute.
What do you want with him?
The guest moped and twitched for quite some time, but finally began. You see, strange as it is, I am here because of Pontius Pilate, just as yourself. Here, the guest looked round fearfully and said, The thing is, a year ago I wrote a novel about Pilate.
You're a writer?
The poet asked, intrigued. The guest glowered, shook his fist at Ivan, and then said, I am a master. He grew serious and extracted an extremely grimy black cap from the pocket of his robe, with an M stencilled on it in yellow silk. Putting it on, he showed himself to Ivan from the front and from the side to prove that he was indeed a master. She sewed it for me with her own 2 hands, he added mysteriously.
And what is your name?
I no longer have a name, the strange guest replied with dark contempt. I have renounced it, just as everything else in life. Let us forget about it.
Then at least tell me about your novel,
Ivan asked tactfully. Be my guest. My story is indeed rather unusual, the guest began. A historian by vocation, he had but 2 years ago worked in one of Moscow's museums and took up translations in his spare time.
From what language?
Ivan asked with interest. I know 5 languages beside my native tongue, the guest replied. English, French, German, Latin, and Greek. Well, I also read a little in Italian.
Well,
Ivan whispered enviously. The historian lived alone, having no relatives anywhere and few friends in Moscow. And, believe it or not, one day he won 100,000 roubles. Imagine my surprise, the guest in the black cap whispered, when I thrust my hand into the laundry bin and saw it. The number was the same as the one in the newspaper. They gave me the ticket at the museum, he clarified. Having won 100 grand, Ivan's mysterious guest did the following. Purchased books, left his room on Myasnitskaya. Oh, that damn hole, the guest growled. And rented a place from a private builder in an alley near the Arbat. You know who these builders are? The guest asked Ivan, and immediately explained. They're a small group of crooks who have somehow managed to survive in Moscow. He rented 2 rooms from a builder in the basement of a small house with a garden. He abandoned his job at the museum and began writing a novel about Pontius Pilate. Ah, that was the golden age, the narrator whispered, his eyes gleaming. A completely separate apartment with a hall and a sink with running water, he noted especially proudly. Tiny windows just above the path that led from the gate. In front of them, 4 steps away, by the fence, lilac, linden, and maple. Oh. Come winter, very rarely would I see someone's black boots in my window and hear the snow crunch beneath them. A flame burned always in my furnace. Suddenly, spring came, and I could see the lilac bushes through the blurry windows, bare at first, and then dressed in green. And it was then, during this past spring, that something infinitely more wonderful than winning 100 grand happened, which you'll agree is an enormous sum of money.
That's true,
a carefully listening Ivan concurred. I opened the tiny windows and sat in the other really tiny room. The guest began measuring space with his hands. Like so. Here's the couch, opposite it another couch, a small table in between, with a wonderful lamp on it. Books near the window, and here a little desk. And in the first room, gigantic room, 150 square feet, books, more books, and the fireplace. Oh, what a place I had. The scent of the lilacs was incredible, and my head grew light with fatigue, and Pilot flew towards the ending.
"White cape, red lining, understood,"
Ivan exclaimed. Exactly. Pilot flew towards the ending, and I already knew that the last words in the novel would be, "The 5th Procurator of Judea, the Knight Pontius Pilate." Well, naturally, I would go out for walks. 100 grand is an enormous sum, and I had an excellent grey suit. Or I would eat at some cheap restaurant. There was a wonderful place on the Arbat. Don't know if it's still there. Then the guest's eyes opened wide, and he continued to whisper, gazing at the moon.